the janitor who outsmarted NASA and stole moon rocks. There is a building in the middle of a vast government complex in the southern United States that holds, inside a reinforced vault, something perhaps more rare and irreplaceable than anything else on the face of the earth. Rocks. Not just any rocks. Rocks that no human being alive today will ever be able to touch again under normal circumstances. Rocks that were gathered by hand from the surface of the moon, brought back across the void of space by astronauts who risked their lives in the most ambitious program of exploration in human history. Rocks that are, in every meaningful sense, fragments of another world, preserved in an atmosphere-free environment behind layers of security, bureaucracy, and federal law. And in the summer of 2002, a young man who had managed to talk his way into the inner sanctum of that facility, a man who had access badges, identification credentials, and the trust of some of the most respected scientists in American aerospace history, walked out of that building with a 272-kilogram safe filled with those rocks strapped to a cart, loaded it into the back of a Jeep Cherokee, and drove away into the Houston night. This is a story about ambition and its shadow. It is a story about the breathtaking audacity of human beings who believe, however briefly and however destructively, that the rules of the world simply do not apply to them. It is a story about the inside of one of the most powerful scientific institutions in the history of civilization and the alarming ease with which that institution's most sacred trust was violated. It is a story about a crime so improbable, so absurd in its conception, and so brazen in its execution that when investigators at the Federal Bureau of Investigation first heard about it, some of them assumed it was a prank. But most of all, it is a story about the moon, about what it means to a civilization to reach beyond its own atmosphere, to send its sons and daughters into the dark, and to bring back something tangible from the other side of the sky. The lunar samples stored inside that safe represented more than scientific data. They were, and remain, among the most powerful symbols of what humanity is capable of when it sets its mind to something impossible. They were, in other words, exactly the kind of thing a young man convinced of his own special destiny might decide he needed to possess. Before we continue, if you are watching or reading this story, and you enjoy deep dive investigative narratives like this one, stories that go beyond the headlines and uncover the full, extraordinary truth behind extraordinary events, we invite you to subscribe to our channel right now. Hit the subscribe button and make sure to activate the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Every week, we bring you stories like this one, true, documented, stranger than fiction. Don't miss them. Part 1. The Making of an Astronaut. To understand how this heist happened, it is necessary to first understand who carried it out, and more specifically, who he believed himself to be. He was, by every conventional measure, one of the most promising young scientists of his generation. Before he was 25 years old, he had enrolled in a triple major program at one of the most respected public universities in the American West, studying simultaneously for degrees in physics, geology, and geophysics. He had founded an astronomy club on his campus that attracted dozens of dedicated members. He was a certified scuba diver and a licensed pilot. He was, in other words, the kind of young man who existed in a permanent state of forward motion, always pressing against the next boundary, always scanning the horizon for the next challenge worth conquering. His particular horizon was Mars. Since childhood, he had been convinced that he would be among the first human beings to set foot on the Red Planet. This was not mere daydreaming. It was a structured, detailed, lifelong ambition backed by an extraordinary academic and extracurricular record. He did not simply want to work for the space agency. He wanted to be an astronaut in the fullest and most demanding sense of the word. He wanted to go. He wanted to feel the vacuum of space, to see the curvature of the Earth, to do the things that only the rarest, most exceptional human beings in history had ever been permitted to do. In 2001, when the space agency's elite cooperative education program, a selective pathway designed to give the nation's most promising young scientists and engineers hands-on experience at the agency's facilities, accepted his application, it must have felt like the first real proof that his self-belief was justified. The co-op program was not a summer internship in the casual sense of the term. It was, and remains, an intensely competitive, a rigorous academic partnership between the agency and a select group of universities that funnels the brightest students directly into the agency's working environment. Being accepted was, in the circles in which he moved, roughly equivalent to being drafted into the major leagues. He arrived at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, in the summer of 2001 with the kind of barely contained excitement that tends to characterize young people who have just arrived at the place they have always been going. The center is, even by the standards of an institution filled with extraordinary facilities, a remarkable place. It covers nearly 650 hectares of flat coastal Texas land and houses dozens of research laboratories, simulation facilities, mission control rooms, and administrative buildings. It is the nerve center of American human spaceflight, the place where astronauts train, where missions are managed, and where, in the specific building that would soon become the center of this story, the physical relics of the greatest adventure in human history are stored. He was assigned to work in the geology laboratories, assisting with the preparation and processing of rock samples. Terrestrial rocks, initially, used to calibrate instruments and develop techniques. The work was detailed, methodical, and not particularly glamorous, but it placed him in daily proximity to some of the most distinguished figures in the field of planetary geology. And more importantly, it gave him access to Building 31 North, the low-profile, nondescript structure that houses what is perhaps the most valuable collection of physical specimens on the surface of the Earth. Building 31 North does not look like what it is. There are no dramatic architectural features, no imposing facades, no obvious markers of its extraordinary contents. It is a utilitarian structure of the kind common to large institutional campuses everywhere. Functional, clean, efficiently designed, entirely unremarkable from the outside. But inside, behind layers of security protocols, controlled atmosphere storage systems, and bureaucratic safeguards, it holds the entirety of NASA's collection of lunar samples. Approximately 382 kilograms of rock, soil, and dust gathered from the surface of the Moon during the 6 successful Apollo landing missions between 1969 and 1972. These samples, the only natural materials from another world ever returned to Earth by human beings, are the physical legacy of one of the defining achievements of the 20th century. Inside Building 31 North, behind layers of controlled atmosphere storage and federal security protocols, rested 382 kilograms of rock gathered from the surface of the Moon during the Apollo missions, the only natural materials from another world ever returned to Earth. The samples are stored under extraordinarily careful conditions. Most are kept in a sealed vault maintained at a controlled atmosphere of pure nitrogen, designed to prevent even the most minute chemical interaction between the lunar materials and the terrestrial environment. The vault is not simply locked. Accessing it requires the simultaneous authorization of at least 2 people, each holding separate portions of an entry procedure designed specifically to prevent any single individual from entering alone. The samples inside are cataloged to individual grams, their chain of custody documented with the kind of rigorous precision one would expect from a facility that knows exactly what it has and what it is worth. And what is it worth? The question is essentially unanswerable in conventional financial terms. Lunar samples cannot be legally bought or sold anywhere in the world. They are the property of the United States federal government, designated as national heritage artifacts and protected under multiple layers of federal criminal statute. They have never been assigned a market value because they have never been on a market. When investigators were later forced to estimate the value of the stolen samples for the purpose of charging documents, they arrived at a figure that has been variously reported as somewhere between $20 and $30 million. But the real answer is that they are priceless. Not in the colloquial sense, but in the literal one. There is no price. This was the collection that the young co-op student was assigned to work near day after day through the summer and fall of 2001 and into the spring of 2002. And it was the collection that during those long months became the object of an increasingly consuming obsession. Part 2. The obsession takes shape. There is a specific species of institutional vulnerability that is almost impossible to design out of any organization that depends on talented, ambitious, yes, highly motivated people to do its work. It is the vulnerability created by trust, Any institution complex enough to accomplish extraordinary things must, at some level, trust the people it has recruited to accomplish them. It must give them access to sensitive areas, to powerful tools, to classified or precious materials. It must, in other words, create the conditions under which a sufficiently determined insider could do it harm. NASA, like every great institution, was not immune to this. The co-op students at the Johnson Space Center were not treated as peripheral figures. They were treated, to a significant degree, as the future of the organization. They were given real access to real facilities and asked to do real work. They were expected to exercise judgment, to demonstrate initiative, and to comport themselves as the serious scientific professionals they were being groomed to become. Most of them did exactly that. They were, by and large, exactly what they appeared to be. Exceptionally talented young people who had been given an extraordinary opportunity and were determined to make the most of it. But the young man who would eventually orchestrate the theft of the lunar samples was not, it turns out, quite what he appeared to be. Behind the triple major and the astronomy club and the pilot's license and the diver's certification and the relentless forward motion was something more complicated. He was also, by his own later admission, a person who had difficulty accepting the proposition that there were things he was not permitted to do. He had, according to various accounts, already demonstrated this in small ways during his time at the center. He had, on at least one occasion, snuck into the space shuttle simulator after hours and used the equipment without authorization, purely for the experience of it. This was not simply rule-breaking for its own sake. It was something more specific and more revealing. It was the behavior of a person who had internalized the conviction that the normal constraints of institutional life simply did not apply to him, that his special destiny and exceptional abilities placed him outside the ordinary perimeter of the rules. It is a pattern that investigators and psychologists who later reviewed the case would recognize as characteristic of a certain kind of entitled brilliance, the kind that can accomplish extraordinary things and, if left unchecked, can also do extraordinary damage. The lunar sample laboratory of one of his supervisors, a distinguished planetary geologist who had spent more than 3 decades studying Apollo mission materials, contained something that became a focal point for this emerging pathology. In that laboratory, on a day in the spring of 2002, the young co-op student encountered a safe. Not just any safe, but a large military-grade 272-kilogram steel cabinet that held, among other things, 53 individual lunar samples drawn from every Apollo lunar landing mission, representing a total of 101 grams of material from multiple sites across the lunar surface. It also held a Martian meteorite, a fragment of the planet Mars that had been blasted into space by an ancient impact and had eventually made its way to Earth, and a collection of personal meteorite specimens that belonged to his supervisor, gathered during decades of fieldwork. The safe was kept inside the laboratory itself, not in the main vault. This was not a security failure in any formal sense. The material inside had largely been processed, studied, and documented. Some of it was technically considered contaminated, in the technical scientific sense that it had been exposed to instruments and chemicals during analysis, making it unsuitable for the most sensitive future research. But this designation did not change the legal status of the samples. They were still federal property, they were still irreplaceable, and they were still, by any standard, among the most extraordinary physical objects on the face of the Earth. He began to think about how to take them. The safe weighed 272 kilograms and held 53 individual lunar samples from every Apollo lunar landing mission. It also contained a fragment of Mars. What happened next would shock an entire nation. The planning process, as reconstructed from later testimony and investigative records, was methodical in a way that illuminated both his intelligence and the depth of his commitment to the scheme. He spent weeks studying the physical environment of Building 31, the locations of security cameras, the patterns of the overnight staff, the shift schedules of the employees responsible for monitoring the facility's electronic surveillance systems. He noted which sensors were heat-sensitive and what their detection parameters were. He made inquiries through apparently casual conversation about the building's access codes. He assembled, piece by piece, a detailed operational picture of the facility's security architecture, not as a trained intelligence professional or professional criminal, but as a highly motivated amateur who happened to have both the analytical skills and the institutional access to do it. He was not working alone. He had enlisted the help of two other people, a fellow co-op student with whom he had recently begun a romantic relationship, and a third intern who was drawn into the scheme through a combination of personal loyalty, romantic attraction, and the peculiar social dynamics of a close-knit group of young people living far from home and intoxicated by proximity to one of the most exciting workplaces in the world. A fourth individual, and an acquaintance from his university years, not a NASA employee, would later play a role in the attempted sale of the stolen materials. The co-op student's romantic partner was a 22-year-old who worked in the center's tissue culture laboratory, conducting stem cell research on NASA's behalf. She was, by all accounts, every bit as intelligent and capable as the man she had become involved with. She had, until this point, done nothing to draw any negative attention to herself. She was simply a talented young scientist doing impressive work at a remarkable institution. She was also, unfortunately, persuadable. Whether she fully understood the magnitude of what she was agreeing to, or whether the excitement of the plan and the intensity of her new relationship obscured her judgment, she agreed to participate. The third member of the group was 19 years old. She would later tell a reporter that she had spent her entire life dreaming of becoming an astronaut. That dream, she would acknowledge, was destroyed by her participation in what followed. Part 3. The Night of the Heist. The date they chose for the theft was sometime in June of 2002. The precise night has been described differently in various accounts, but the broad contours of what happened are not significantly disputed. Late in the evening, when the building was largely empty and the security camera monitoring system had been compromised, the cameras looped. The live feed replaced with earlier footage. 3 young people arrived at Building 31 North in a Jeep Cherokee loaded with equipment. The building's front entrance was secured by a keypad entry system. The code, which should have been unknown to anyone outside a narrow circle of current authorized personnel, had been obtained by the ringleader through what can only be described as a remarkable failure of basic security hygiene. A former co-worker had simply emailed it to him. This is perhaps the single most striking illustration of the trust-based vulnerability described earlier. The co-op program operated on a foundation of mutual confidence between the institution and its students. That confidence, in this case, was exploited with disarming simplicity. Once inside, the two who entered the building, the ringleader and his partner, changed their clothes in a bathroom. From duffel bags they had carried in, they removed and donned 2mm thick neoprene diving suits, the same material used in wetsuits. The suits served a specific technical purpose. The vault containing the processed lunar samples was equipped with heat-sensitive motion detectors designed to identify the thermal signature of a human body moving through the space. The neoprene, by muffling the infrared output of their bodies, was intended to defeat this system. The same vault was maintained in a zero-oxygen atmosphere, requiring the two intruders to carry and use portable breathing equipment during their time inside. The third member of the team remained in the vehicle in the parking lot, monitoring the compromised camera feeds from a device that allowed her to warn the others if anything went wrong. She was, in the parlance of professional criminal enterprises, the lookout. Inside the building, the two moved through the corridors to the laboratory where the safe was kept. What they found when they reached it presented them with a problem they had not fully anticipated. The safe was equipped with a combination lock, and the combination, which they had apparently hoped to find written on a tag attached to the safe, a reminder note for authorized personnel, turned out not to contain the actual code, but rather a reference note pointing back to the supervisor who held the combination. They could not open it. This should have been the moment at which the scheme collapsed. A rational assessment of the situation, 2 people in neoprene suits, breathing from portable oxygen equipment in a laboratory inside a heavily secured government facility, confronted with a safe they could not open, might have led most people to abandon the operation and retreat while they still could. But rationality at this point had largely ceased to govern the proceedings. Instead, they loaded the safe onto a hand truck, a dolly that they had brought with them for precisely this purpose, and wheeled the 272-kilogram steel cabinet through the corridors of Building 31, out of the building, across the loading dock, and into the back of the Jeep Cherokee. If this sounds improbable, the improbability is precisely the point. The safe was extraordinarily heavy. Moving it required significant physical effort and a complete absence of unexpected witnesses. That they managed to accomplish this without being seen or stopped is, in retrospect, one of the more remarkable operational details of the entire episode. They drove to a motel in the Clear Lake area near the Space Center. There, using a power tool, and the specific accounts vary, with some sources describing a power saw, others a drill, they broke open the safe and accessed its contents for the first time. Inside were the 53 lunar samples, the Martian meteorite, and the personal meteorite collection belonging to the supervisor. They removed the samples, discarded the empty safe, and left. They loaded a 272-kilogram safe onto a hand truck and wheeled it through the corridors of one of the most secured buildings in American aerospace history. No alarms triggered, no cameras caught them. They simply walked out with the moon. What happened next has become, in the subsequent years, the most widely reported and most sensationalized element of the story, partly because it is, in isolation, so extraordinary, and partly because the young man at the center of the scheme was himself not shy about describing it. With the lunar samples now in their possession, he and his partner spent a portion of that night in a way that has become inextricably associated with the heist in the public imagination, a detail so bizarre, so far outside the normal parameters of criminal behavior that it simultaneously illuminates the personality of the person who conceived it, and the degree to which the entire enterprise had become untethered from any recognizable form of rational judgment. He scattered the lunar samples across the bed of the motel room and, in his words, made love on top of them. He later described this in interviews conducted after his release from prison as an act of romantic expression, a way of giving his partner the moon. Whether this characterization accurately reflects his motivations, or whether it is a retrospective aestheticization of something more prosaic, it is, at minimum, a detail that says something important about the psychology of the person responsible for the theft. This was not, at its core, a professional criminal operation conducted for material gain. It was, at some level, a performance, an act carried out for an audience of one, designed to prove something about the kind of person the performer believed himself to be. The samples were subsequently moved to his partner's apartment, where they were stored while the group continued to report to work at the Johnson Space Center as if nothing had happened. For 2 days, NASA did not notice that anything was missing. The discovery, when it came, generated a level of institutional shock that is difficult to overstate. The lunar sample collection was one of the most carefully inventoried, most assiduously protected repositories in the agency's history. The idea that someone had walked out with a significant portion of it was, to the scientists and administrators who learned of it, essentially incomprehensible. Part 4. The Stolen Legacy of Apollo. To understand why the theft of these particular materials represented such an exceptional crime, not merely legally, but in a deeper, more consequential sense, it is necessary to step back and consider what the Apollo lunar samples actually are and why they matter. Between July 1969 and December 1972, the United States successfully landed 6 crews of astronauts on the surface of the moon. The primary scientific objective of these missions, beyond the geopolitical and technological demonstration involved, was the collection and return of geological samples that could be studied by Earth-based scientists. Over the course of those 6 missions, astronauts gathered 382 kilograms of material from 6 different sites across the lunar surface, providing researchers with a geological record of the moon's formation and evolution that could not have been obtained in any other way. These samples have been analyzed by scientists in more than 24 countries over more than 5 decades. They have fundamentally transformed our understanding of the formation of the Earth-Moon system, the history of the early solar system, and the processes by which planets form and evolve. They have yielded information about the massive impact event, the collision of a Mars-sized body with the early Earth, that is now the dominant scientific theory for the moon's origin. They have provided critical data about the timeline of solar system formation and the history of asteroid bombardment in the inner solar system. In short, they are among the most scientifically significant physical objects ever studied, but their significance extends beyond the purely scientific. They are also, in the most direct and tangible sense possible, objects brought back from another world by human beings at the cost of extraordinary effort, risk, and sacrifice. 12 men walked on the moon to gather these samples. 3 men died in a launch pad fire during preparations for the first lunar mission. 7 more died in the Challenger disaster and the Columbia disaster in the decades that followed. The Apollo samples are, in a very real sense, paid for in human lives and human courage. This is the context in which the theft must be understood. The young co-op student and his accomplices did not simply steal federal property. They violated the physical legacy of one of the defining moments of human civilization. They took objects that belonged, in the most fundamental sense, to everyone. Objects whose value was not commercial but cultural, scientific, and historical, and treated them as personal property to be sold for private gain. In doing so, they also irreparably destroyed something that no crime or civil proceeding could ever fully repair. One of the dimensions of the damage that tends to receive less attention in popular accounts of the case is the destruction of research records. The supervisor whose safe was stolen had spent more than 30 years conducting research on the specific samples that were taken. His laboratory contained notebooks, data files, annotated records, and analytical results accumulated over 3 decades of painstaking scientific work. Much of this material was stored near or associated with the safe itself, and a significant portion of it was destroyed, damaged, or rendered unusable in the course of the theft and its aftermath. 30 years of scientific work, irreplaceable context for understanding the very samples that were stolen, was effectively erased. The chain of custody for the samples was also permanently broken. Lunar samples, precisely because of their scientific sensitivity, are maintained with an extraordinarily rigorous documentation trail. Every person who has handled them, every instrument they have been exposed to, every analysis performed on them is recorded and archived. This chain of custody is not merely administrative formality. It is scientifically essential because contamination of lunar samples, even trace contamination, can render them useless for certain types of analysis. The handling that occurred between the theft and the sample's eventual recovery by federal agents introduced contamination of unknown extent and nature, permanently compromising the scientific value of every sample involved. The supervisor had spent more than 30 years studying those specific lunar samples. The theft did not merely steal rocks, it erased 3 decades of irreplaceable scientific research in a single night. These are not abstract losses. They represent real diminishment of the fund of human knowledge about the origin and history of the solar system. They represent the permanent degradation of the scientific value of materials that can never be replaced, gathered on missions that will never be repeated in the same way. They represent, in short, a crime not merely against the United States government, but against the scientific project itself, against the collective human endeavor to understand the universe. Part 5. The sale that never was the plan had been to sell the samples. This had, from the beginning, been the ostensible purpose of the theft, though the precise balance between financial motivation and the kind of romantic grandiosity that expressed itself in motel rooms strewn with lunar material is, and probably always will be, impossible to determine with certainty. What is certain is that within days of the heist, the group began making moves to find a buyer. The logistics of selling stolen moon rocks on the black market are, it turns out, considerably more complicated than the logistics of stealing them. Lunar samples are not merely federally protected, they are unique, identifiable, and almost entirely without precedent as items of commerce. There is no established black market for lunar material of the kind that exists for, I'd say, antiquities, or even certain categories of meteorites. The universe of potential buyers who could both afford the price being sought and navigate the extraordinary legal and practical risks involved in possessing the material was vanishingly small. The approach they chose was, in retrospect, almost incomprehensibly reckless. The 4th member of the group, the university acquaintance, posted an advertisement on the website of a mineralogy club based in Belgium. The post described the availability of a rare and extraordinarily valuable rock specimen and invited serious inquiries from potential buyers. It was, in structure and language, the kind of advertisement one might post in the legitimate collector's market for unusual specimens, except that it was advertising stolen federal property worth potentially tens of millions of dollars, and the email correspondence it generated was conducted partly from servers located at the Johnson Space Center itself. The Belgian mineralogy community is small, specialized, and, as it turned out, not without members who recognized a highly anomalous situation when they encountered one. An amateur collector who received the advertisement was sufficiently intrigued and sufficiently suspicious to examine it carefully. The price being offered, far below what any educated person would expect for authenticated lunar material, if such material could theoretically be purchased, struck him as wrong in a way that suggested either a fraud or something considerably more alarming. He made contact with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI's response to this information was rapid and decisive. Investigators quickly traced the email correspondence back through the chain of addresses and identified the Johnson Space Center as the origin point of some of the messages. The combination of the claim to possess lunar samples and the confirmation that the emails were originating from inside NASA's most important facility for lunar sample storage created, in the words of one of the investigators who later described the case, a situation of immediate and extraordinary urgency. There was essentially no scenario in which this was not a very serious crime. What followed was a textbook sting operation. FBI agents working in coordination with NASA's Office of the Inspector General posed as representatives of the Belgian collector and engaged in negotiations with the group. The correspondence that followed included, from the ringleader's side, communications of remarkable candor, including explicit acknowledgement that he was aware of the legal status of the material he was selling and that he intended to conduct the transaction in a way that minimized his exposure. These communications would later form a significant part of the evidence presented at his federal criminal proceedings. The meeting was arranged for July 20th, 2002, a date that the ringleader may or may not have chosen deliberately, but which turned out to be, almost exactly, the 33rd anniversary of the first Apollo lunar landing. The location was a restaurant in a city in Central Florida. The ringleader and his partner arrived expecting to meet wealthy European buyers. They met instead with federal agents carrying arrest warrants. All three members of the core group present that day. The ringleader, his partner, and the university acquaintance who had brokered the sale were arrested on the spot. The samples were recovered at the scene. The third intern who had served as lookout on the night of the theft was arrested separately in the subsequent days. The heist, which had begun in the early hours of a summer morning with the quiet rolling of a safe through empty corridors, ended in the parking lot of a Florida restaurant in broad daylight. The meeting was set for July 20th, 2002, the 33rd anniversary of the first lunar landing. The buyers waiting at the restaurant were FBI agents. The moon had come home. Part 6. The Reckoning. The legal proceedings that followed were, in their broad outlines, relatively swift and comprehensive. The ringleader entered a guilty plea to charges of conspiracy to commit theft of government property and interstate transportation of stolen goods. He was sentenced to 100 months in federal prison, slightly over 8 years, a sentence that reflected both the severity of the crime and the extensive aggravating circumstances, including the irreparable damage to the scientific research of his supervisor and the permanent contamination of the chain of custody for the stolen samples. His romantic partner pleaded guilty to charges related to her participation in the theft and sale. She received a significantly lighter sentence: 180 days of house arrest, 150 hours of community service, 3 years of probation, and an order to pay more than $9,000 in restitution to NASA. The other intern who had served as lookout received similar terms. The university acquaintance who had brokered the sale and who insisted at trial that he had not known the full nature of what he was selling was convicted and sentenced to 72 months in federal prison, 6 years. The sentences, particularly for the women involved, generated some controversy. Critics argued that the disparity between the sentence received by the ringleader and those received by his partners was inconsistent with their actual respective levels of culpability. Defenders of the outcome argued that the ringleader was the architect of the scheme and bore the primary responsibility for what had happened. The debate about the appropriate calibration of these sentences and the broader question of how the law should handle participants in a conspiracy who may have had varying degrees of understanding about the full scope of what they were involved in is one that the case raised without fully resolving. The ringleader served slightly over 6 years of his sentence before being released in 2008. During his time in prison, by his own account, he devoted himself to developing a theoretical framework for a unified theory of quantum gravity, what he called quantum space theory, which he claimed could reconcile the incompatibilities between Einstein's general relativity and quantum mechanics. He wrote about this work publicly after his release and attracted a small following of enthusiasts interested in his ideas. The scientific community's reception of his theoretical work was, to put it gently, skeptical. He has spoken on record about the theft and its consequences on multiple occasions since his release. His accounts have been notable for a certain quality of partial acknowledgement that stops consistently short of full moral reckoning. He has said variously that he did it for love, that he did not think of it as stealing at the time, that he intended to use the proceeds to fund scientific research that could change the world, and that he regrets his actions. These explanations are not necessarily inconsistent with one another, but they do not collectively amount to a clear and direct account of how a person of evident intelligence and ability arrived at the decision to steal the physical legacy of the Apollo program and sell it on the internet. The romantic partner he stole the moon to impress was never seen or heard from by him again after the arrest. They did not speak in the years that followed. Whatever he had hoped to prove to her in that motel room in Clear Lake, whatever the scattering of lunar material across a bed was meant to demonstrate about the kind of person he was, the proof did not survive contact with the consequences. Part 7. The wider meaning. In the years since the case concluded, it has attracted a disproportionate amount of popular attention relative to its formal legal significance. Books have been written about it. A major publishing house released a full-length account in 2011, based primarily on extensive interviews with the ringleader that became a bestseller. A National Geographic documentary examined the case in detail. Hollywood acquired the rights to the story. It has been discussed in legal textbooks as a study in the complications of prosecuting insider theft of unique scientific materials, and in psychology literature as a case study in the pathologies of entitlement and risk tolerance in high-achieving individuals. Much of this popular attention has focused on the most sensational elements: the neoprene bodysuits, the motel room, the Belgian mineralogy website, the anniversary of the moon landing arrest. These details are, it must be acknowledged, genuinely extraordinary, and they tend to make the story easy to tell in a way that emphasizes its absurdist dimensions at the expense of its more consequential ones. What tends to get less attention in the popular accounts is the damage, not to NASA's institutional pride or to the careers of the people involved, but to the actual science. The contamination and chain of custody disruption affecting the stolen samples is a permanent condition. Those 101 grams of lunar material are less scientifically valuable today than they were on the morning of the theft, and they will never recover their original value. The analytical potential they represented before they were handled by unauthorized individuals in a motel room and a Florida apartment is gone. For researchers whose work depends on the precise characterization of the conditions under which samples have been handled and stored, those particular samples have been permanently impaired as scientific instruments. The destruction of the supervisor's research records is perhaps even more significant, though it receives even less attention. 30 years of scientific work, annotated observations, unpublished data, raw measurements, personal notes, was lost in a single night. That work cannot be reconstructed. The insights it might have yielded, the publications it might have produced, the contributions it might have made to humanity's understanding of the early solar system are simply gone. They are as irretrievably lost as the context from which they emerged. This is the cost that does not appear on any criminal docket or sentencing memorandum. It cannot be expressed in months of imprisonment or dollars of restitution. It is a cost measured in the permanent diminishment of what we know and what we might have known, in the narrowing of the frontier of human understanding by a margin that will never be recovered. It is, in its way, a greater crime than the theft itself. 30 years of irreplaceable scientific research, a permanent break in the chain of custody for one of humanity's greatest scientific treasures. These are the damages that no sentence, no restitution, no documentary could ever fully account for. The case also raised, and continues to raise, Important questions about the institutional culture of organizations that depend on the trusted access of large numbers of people to operate effectively. NASA's co-op program was, and largely remains, one of the most effective talent development pipelines in American science and engineering. The vast majority of the young people who have passed through it have done so with distinction, integrity, and genuine benefit, both to themselves and to the agency. The program exists because it must trust its participants, because the work it is designed to do cannot be done otherwise. But trust, as this case demonstrated with uncommon clarity, is a vulnerability as much as it is a strength. The young man who wheeled a safe full of moon rocks out of Building 31 was able to do so not because NASA's physical security was inadequate, though the case revealed specific ways in which it could be strengthened, but because he had been granted access to the facility on the basis of a mutual understanding that he would behave with the integrity appropriate to the institution. He violated that understanding. The question of how an institution protects itself against such violations without destroying the trust that makes it functional in the first place does not have a simple answer, and the case did not provide one. What the case did provide was a set of concrete lessons that NASA and other government agencies responsible for maintaining irreplaceable scientific materials absorbed and acted upon. The security protocols at the Lunar Sample Laboratory were substantially revised in the years following the theft. Access controls were tightened, camera systems were hardened against the kind of tampering that had been exploited, and the procedures governing the overnight presence of co-op students in sensitive facilities were revised. These changes were, in the main, sensible and necessary. They were also, in the way of all reactive security improvements, insufficient in ways that no one can fully anticipate until the next creative and determined insider finds them. Part 8. The Moon Belongs to Everyone. There is a moment in the documented history of space exploration that is relevant to this story, even though it predates it by more than 3 decades. It is the moment at which President Richard Nixon, in the months following the return of the first lunar samples to Earth, made the decision to distribute portions of those samples, small fragments carefully mounted in lucite for display, to every nation on the surface of the planet. These goodwill gifts, as they were called, were sent to heads of state and governments around the world as a gesture intended to communicate something specific, that the achievement represented by the Apollo program was not exclusively American, but belonged in some meaningful sense to all of humanity. The gesture was partly political, of course, a demonstration of American technological and organizational supremacy at the height of the Cold War, translated into the language of international generosity. But it was also, in its own way, a genuine expression of something real, the sense that when human beings accomplish something truly extraordinary, the achievement is not the property of the nation or the institution or the program that accomplished it, but is, in a deeper sense, a contribution to the common fund of human achievement and aspiration that transcends any particular political or cultural boundary. Many of those goodwill moon rocks have subsequently gone missing. This is a story in itself, a chronicle of diplomatic carelessness, institutional neglect, theft, and bureaucratic indifference that has been the subject of ongoing investigations by former agency employees and their students for more than 2 decades. Some have been stolen, some have been accidentally discarded, some are held in museums that don't know what they have. Some have found their way into private collections. The fate of the Goodwill Rocks is, in miniature, a parable about what happens to priceless and irreplaceable things when the institutions responsible for them fail to protect them with appropriate seriousness. The 2002 heist at the Johnson Space Center is the most dramatic episode in this larger story of the mismanagement and violation of humanity's lunar heritage. But it is not the only episode, and it is not, in terms of aggregate damage to the scientific and cultural value of the Apollo collection, even necessarily the most significant. The slow, quiet erosion of the Goodwill Rock collection through a combination of theft, neglect, and institutional indifference has, taken together, probably deprived the world of more lunar material than any single criminal act. What the 2002 heist has that the other cases lack is a human face and a human story. A protagonist whose combination of brilliance and destructive arrogance is both comprehensible and deeply troubling. A narrative arc that moves from ambition through obsession to catastrophe with the inexorable logic of a classical tragedy. It is a story that people find compelling precisely because it is about recognizable human emotions, ambition, desire, the need to prove oneself extraordinary, translated into extraordinarily consequential action. But the human drama should not obscure the underlying reality. The moon is not a romantic backdrop. It is a world. The rocks brought back from it are not symbols or props. They are scientific instruments of irreplaceable value, gathered at extraordinary cost and maintained for the specific purpose of advancing humanity's understanding of the universe. They belong, in the most fundamental sense, to everyone who has ever looked up at the night sky and felt the pull of the unknown. They belong to the schoolchildren who will study them 50 years from now, and the scientists who will find in them answers to questions that have not yet been formulated. They belong to the future. The young man who stole them understood this at some level. He said as much in his more reflective moments in the years after his release. He spoke about the awe he felt when he held the samples in his hands, the sense of connection to something vast and significant, the feeling of holding a piece of another world and understanding viscerally what that meant. He understood what they were. He simply believed in the catastrophic and all too human way of a certain kind of brilliant, entitled person, that understanding what something is worth gives you the right to take it. He understood what they were worth. He understood what they meant. He simply believed, as brilliant, entitled people sometimes do, that understanding gives you the right to possess. It does not. The moon belongs to everyone, and the rocks brought back from it are a trust held on everyone's behalf. The theft and partial destruction of that trust, the contamination of samples, the loss of research records, the permanent break in the chain of custody that connects those 101 grams of lunar material to the missions that gathered them and the scientists who spent their careers understanding them, is a loss that will not be fully calculated for decades, nor if ever. It is a loss that cannot be reversed by any sentence or any restitution or any book or documentary. What remains is the story, and the story matters, not because it is entertaining, though it is, and not because it is instructive about security protocols, though it is that too, but because it is a story about what we value and what we are willing to do to protect it. It is a story about the price of trust and the cost of its violation. It is a story about the things that belong to everyone and the rare individuals who are willing to treat them as their own. It is a story about the moon and what it means to reach for something larger than yourself and find in your hand something smaller than you had any right to hope for. Epilogue. Where they are now, the ringleader was released from federal prison in 2008, having served slightly more than 6 years of his sentence. In the years following his release, he pursued his interest in theoretical physics and developed what he called quantum space theory, a proposed framework for reconciling quantum mechanics and general relativity. He gave public talks, maintained a presence on internet forums, and spoke openly about his time at NASA and its consequences. He has described himself as a changed person and has expressed, in various formulations, regret for his actions. Whether that regret encompasses the full scope of the damage he caused, including the destruction of his supervisor's research, has been a matter of some debate among those who have followed his subsequent public statements. His partner, who received house arrest and probation rather than a prison sentence, disappeared from public view after the conclusion of the legal proceedings. The two have reportedly never spoken since their arrest in the Florida restaurant on that July afternoon in 2002. The third intern, the 19-year-old lookout, who had dreamed of becoming an astronaut, has also remained largely outside public view since the case concluded. Her statement to reporters before sentencing, in which she described how her own actions had shattered a lifelong dream, stands as perhaps the most poignant single moment in the public record of the case. She was 19 years old when she helped wheel a safe full of moon rocks out of a government building, and she spent the years that followed living with the consequences. The university acquaintance who was convicted at trial rather than pleading guilty served his sentence, and was released. His particular claim that he had not understood the full nature of what he was selling was rejected by the jury, but has continued to be discussed by legal analysts examining the case as an example of the difficulties of assessing knowledge and intent in conspiracy prosecutions. The supervisor whose safe was stolen, whose 30 years of research were lost, and whose samples were contaminated, continued his scientific work after the theft. He was interviewed for the National Geographic documentary about the case and spoke with evident pain about the destruction of his research records. He was among those who pushed back against the more romanticized popular accounts of the heist, which tended to focus on the glamour of the crime at the expense of its genuine costs. The stolen samples were all recovered, though in a condition permanently altered by their unauthorized handling. They have been returned to the Johnson Space Center and are maintained in the Lunar sample collection, flagged for the contamination and chain of custody disruption they suffered. They remain federal property. They remain irreplaceable. They remain, in the fullest sense, ours. The Moon, for its part, continues to orbit the Earth at a mean distance of approximately 384,400 kilometers. It does not remember being robbed. It has no way of knowing. But the people who study it, the geologists and cosmochemists and planetary scientists who have spent their careers coaxing its secrets from the fragments brought back by 12 human beings who walked on its surface more than 50 years ago, they remember. They will go on remembering for as long as the science lasts, which is to say, for as long as there are human beings curious enough to ask where they came from and how the world they live on came to be. That is what was nearly lost. That is what was partially destroyed. That is what it means to steal the moon.